The dog was caught in the wire before the sun had properly cleared the kitchen garden wall, and Clara Fenwick had been watching it struggle for 3 full minutes before she crossed the gravel path and knelt beside it in the November cold. She did not call for a footman. She did not look behind her to see whether anyone stood at the windows of the east wing. She worked the wire loose from around the terrier's foreleg with the same quiet attention she brought to everything. The morning correspondence she drafted but never signed, the flowers she arranged in rooms she would not sit in, the small daily labours of a household that ran on her effort and took no account of her presence. The dog pressed its cold nose against her wrist once the wire came free. She held very still. Then, because no one was watching, because the morning was grey and empty and the kitchen garden was the one place in all of Harwick Park where she was reliably alone, she said, very quietly, "There you are." 2 words, nothing more. But they were spoken in a clear, unhurried voice, the voice of a woman who had once known how to fill a room with it, and who had learned by careful degrees that silence was the only instrument left to her. She stood, brushed the garden soil from her skirts, and walked back toward the house as if nothing had happened. She did not see the figure standing at the gap in the kitchen garden wall, half obscured by the bare hedgerow, watching with the patient stillness of someone who had just found what he had come looking for. Lady Harwick was in the morning room by 8:30, which meant the day's first difficulty had already begun. She sat at the writing desk with the attitude of a woman conducting business too important to acknowledge. Her correspondence spread before her in the precise arrangement that Clara had set out the previous evening. The tea Clara had brought at 7:45 stood cooling at Lady Harwick's elbow. She had not thanked Clara for it. She never did, not because she was inattentive to such details, but because thanks implied an equal, and equality was not a category Lady Harwick recognised when it came to Clara Fenwick. "You may stand there," Lady Harwick said without looking up. "Sir Edmund Granger calls at 11. I have written to confirm it." She turned a page. "You will be dressed and ready in the small parlour by 7:15. You will not embarrass me." She looked up then, and her gaze travelled over Clara with the unhurried appraisal of a woman assessing an unreliable domestic object. "You look pale. Ask Nettie to do something with your hair." She returned to her letters. "That will be all." Clara dipped her chin and left the room. In the corridor she passed Mrs. Pratt, the housekeeper, who had served the Fenwick household for 22 years, and who looked at Clara with an expression that was, in the grammar of Mrs. Pratt's careful face, as close to an apology as anything she was permitted to offer. Clara did not pause. The corridor was not a safe place for communications of any kind, and both of them knew it. The story that Lady Harwick told, to Sir Edmund, to the neighbouring families, to the occasional visitor who passed through Harwick Park and asked after Mr. Fenwick's daughter, was a simple one. Clara had suffered a brain fever 3 years previous, at the time of her father's death, and the fever had taken her speech. She was sensible enough for domestic purposes. She was gentle. She was, Lady Harwick added in a tone of practised sorrow, unlikely to improve. The story had the particular quality of lies that are built around a true inconvenience. Clara's father had indeed died 3 years ago. There had indeed been an illness in the house that winter, and Clara had indeed stopped speaking, though the reason had nothing to do with fever and everything to do with what she had heard the night after the funeral, standing in the dark of her father's study while Lady Harwick spoke to the solicitor about what it would take to have the estate managed without the daughter's interference. She had understood, that night, that her silence was the only negotiating position she possessed. A mute girl could not object to a marriage contract. A mute girl could not appear in a solicitor's office and dispute the terms of her father's will. A mute girl could not be publicly contradicted because a mute girl had said nothing publicly to contradict. And so she had kept it, the silence, as a woman might keep a borrowed coat in a cold winter, knowing it was not hers and knowing also that without it she would freeze. Sir Edmund Granger called at 11 as Lady Harwick had arranged, and he sat in the small parlour in the way of a man who has already been given a gift and is waiting for the wrapping to be removed. He was not unkind precisely. He was large and well-dressed, and carried himself with the uncomplicated assurance of a man who had inherited a good income and had never been asked to justify it. He looked at Clara with an expression that was attentive in the manner of a buyer looking at a horse, not cruel but unambiguous about the nature of the transaction. He spoke to Lady Harwick about the settlement. He spoke about the estate in Cheshire and about the house at Kensington and about what he proposed by way of pin money, each figure delivered in the measured tone of a man who expects to be found reasonable. He looked at Clara and nodded at intervals, as though confirming each term against her physical presence. At one point he leaned slightly toward her and said in a confidential tone, "Lady Harwick has explained your particular situation to me. You need not be anxious. I have no expectations of conversation." He smiled in a way that was meant to be reassuring, and that was not. Clara sat with her hands folded and looked at the far window, where the November garden was the colour of pewter, and she thought about the dog in the wire, and about the 2 words she had spoken into the cold morning air, and about the figure she had not quite seen at the gap in the hedgerow. Sir Edmund stayed the hour Lady Harwick had allocated for him, and then she walked him to the entrance hall, and Clara heard them talking in the low voices of people arranging matters, and the words settlement and fortnight's end carried through the closed parlour door with a clarity that suggested they were not particularly concerned about being overheard. It had been a week since the new surveyor had come to Harwick Park. Mr. Ashby, introduced by letter as an agent engaged to assess the boundary dispute between Harwick and the adjoining Aldenmere estate, had arrived on a damp Tuesday with a single valise and the manner of a man who was accustomed to finding his own level in an unfamiliar room. He was not remarkable to look at. He was perhaps 30 years of age, lean, dark-haired, wearing the plain wool coat of a man who worked outdoors. Lady Harwick had placed him in the east guest room on the instruction of her solicitor, and had thereafter treated him as one treats a useful piece of furniture, present when required, otherwise unnoticed. Clara had noticed him, because Clara noticed everything in the household that might constitute a change in the weather. He had a habit of stillness that was unusual in a man who was ostensibly busy with maps and measurements. He ate his meals in the estate office and declined the dining room, which Lady Harwick interpreted as professional discretion, and which Clara interpreted as something else she could not yet name. His hands were very clean for a surveyor's. The surveyor's instruments he carried were of exceptional quality. When he crossed the entrance hall on the second morning of his stay, he had held the door open for Nettie, who was carrying a tray, and had waited until she was clear of the threshold before he moved. A small automatic courtesy that no one in Harwick Park had extended to a household servant in 3 years. If this story moves you as it moves those who keep it close, consider staying with it a little longer. Some stories earn their endings by the patience of those who wait for them. Sir Edmund stayed an hour. After he left, Lady Harwick found Clara in the corridor outside the morning room and said, in the voice she used for irrevocable statements, "The contract will be drawn by the fortnight's end. You will conduct yourself accordingly." She paused. She looked at Clara's face for a moment with an expression that was almost evaluative. The brief attention of a woman who was genuinely curious sometimes about what went on behind the silence. "I know you hear me perfectly well," she said at last. It was the only acknowledgement she ever made of the understanding between them, that the silence was a performance, and that Lady Harwick had chosen to require the performance for her own reasons. Clara held her gaze for a moment. Then she looked away, which was what Lady Harwick expected, and what Clara gave her because it cost nothing, and closed the conversation. Lady Harwick moved past her towards the staircase. At the foot of it she paused and said, without turning, "Sir Edmund is not an ungenerous man. You will want to remember that when the time comes." She went upstairs. Clara stood in the corridor alone with the thin November light coming through the fanlight above the entrance door, and the scratch of Mrs. Pratt's pen audible from somewhere in the housekeeper's room, and the distant sound of carriage wheels on gravel as Sir Edmund's equipage rolled away down the drive, and the stillness that was not quiet at all, but the accumulated weight of every calculation being made on her behalf by people who had not thought to consult her. The kitchen garden was empty on Thursday afternoon when Mr. Ashby found her there again. Clara was cutting the last of the autumn herbs, the ones Mrs. Pratt needed for the still room. And she looked up when she heard his step on the gravel and gave him the small nod she gave everyone in the household, the gesture that said present and functional and requiring nothing. He stopped a few feet away and looked at the rosemary in her basket. "Mrs. Pratt mentioned the kitchen garden was the best in the county," he said, which was an unexceptional remark, the kind of thing a surveyor might say to fill a silence. Clara nodded again and returned to the cutting. He did not leave. She was aware of him standing there in the grey afternoon light, in the unhurried way he seemed to stand everywhere, as though he had been given more time than other men and had learned to spend it carefully. "I saw you this morning," he said then, and his voice had shifted by a fraction, lower, more deliberate. "With the terrier." Clara went very still. Her hands held the rosemary shears without moving. "He is quite recovered," Mr. Ashby said. "I made certain of it." He paused, and in the pause she could hear the November wind moving through the bare hedgerow and the distant sound of a cart on the lane, and nothing else. "You need not perform anything for my benefit," he said. Then he walked away, and she stood in the kitchen garden for a long time afterward, with the shears in her hands, and the smell of rosemary cold and sharp in the November air. He had heard her. She understood this fully now, turning it in her mind in the privacy of her own room that evening, while Nettie dressed her hair, for nothing in particular. He had been at the gap in the hedgerow. He had heard 2 words spoken by a woman the entire household believed incapable of speech. He had said nothing about it to Lady Harwick. He had not used it. He had come to the kitchen garden and told her, in terms she could not mistake, that he already knew the truth. The calculation she was accustomed to making. What does this person want from my silence? What will they take from my speaking? Failed entirely when applied to Mr. Ashby, and the failure was so complete that she had to sit with it for several days before she understood that it was not, in fact, a threat. It was something she had no good word for because the vocabulary of Regency domestic life did not readily supply one. It was closer to, "I see you." It was closer to, "You are not obliged to disappear on my account." She found him in the estate library on Saturday afternoon, which surprised her, because the estate library was her domain. The room Lady Harwick never entered, the room that smelled of old leather bindings and the particular dusty cold of shelves that had not been properly aired since before her father died. He was standing at the long table with a map spread before him, and he looked up when she entered with the same unhurried attention he gave to everything, and said nothing at all. Clara crossed to the far shelves and took down the volume she had come for, A Natural History, the one with the pressed flowers between the pages that her father had gathered on their last long walk together along the Harwick boundary, and sat at the table across the map from him, at a proper and entirely correct distance, and opened the book. They did not speak. The fire in the grate was low but warm. The afternoon light came in through the east windows, at the angle that always made the library feel amber rather than grey. And outside the window the old rose canes were stripped bare and tangled against the wall. And the entire house was quiet in the particular way it was quiet on a Saturday afternoon, when Lady Howick had gone to call on Mrs. Aldridge and would not return until 5. Clara turned a page. He made a notation on his map. After perhaps 20 minutes, he said, without looking up, "The pressed gentian. Between pages 41 and 42. It is Gentiana verna, the spring gentian, unusual this far south." He said it as one might note a fact of no particular urgency, the way a man might speak who was accustomed to noting things accurately and saw no reason to withhold accurate observations. Clara did not speak, but she set her hand flat on the open page, and when he looked up, she let him see her face clearly for the first time. Not the performing face, not the careful, empty expression the household required, but the actual face of a woman who had been in a room alone with a comprehending person for the first time in 3 years. He held her gaze for a moment that was entirely too long to be ordinary. Then he looked back at his map, and something in his shoulders eased, and she understood that she had just answered a question he had not spoken aloud. She stayed another hour. He did not attempt further conversation, and she was grateful for it, because conversation would have required her to be careful in a room where she was tired of being careful, and his company, the unremarkable fact of another person's presence that asked nothing, was a thing she had not had in so long that she had forgotten the name for it. When she left the library, the light had already gone from amber to the flat grey of late November, and she walked through the empty entrance hall with the natural history under her arm and the pressed gentian still between pages 41 and 42. And she felt, for the first time in 3 years, that she was carrying something of her own. He was in the kitchen garden on the following Tuesday in the rain. She saw him from the east window while she was answering the correspondence Lady Howick had left for her. The invitations that required acceptances in a voice that was not Clara's, but would be signed in Lady Howick's name, as though Clara were a useful implement for producing a particular kind of text. The rain came in steadily from the west, and Mr. Ashby was standing near the kitchen garden wall, with his coat collar turned and a notebook open, making some notation about the boundary drainage, apparently indifferent to the weather. Clara set down the pen. She went to the kitchen entrance and stood under the small stone lintel and watched him work for a moment. He looked up and saw her. She held out her hand with the palm up, which was the gesture for, "You are being rained upon rather thoroughly." He looked at his hand, which was, in fact, quite wet, and then looked back at her, and for a moment his expression shifted in the way she had seen it shift once or twice before. Not a smile exactly, but something very near the structure of one, a quiet recognition that something true had been observed. He came out of the rain and stood under the lintel with her, close enough that she was aware of the cold coming off his coat and the smell of rain on wool. And he looked out at the garden with the patient, unhurried attention he gave to everything, and she stood beside him in the shelter of the stone with her shoulder an inch from his arm. And the rain fell on the kitchen garden, and the rosemary stood in its rows, and the terrier nosed at the door behind them, wanting in. And for 3 full minutes neither of them said anything at all, and the silence between them was the most honest thing that had happened in Harwick Park in 3 years. The betrayal came not through a door she expected, but through one she had forgotten to guard. The west passage outside the morning room was a thoroughfare she rarely used on a Wednesday afternoon in November, and she was in it only because Mrs. Pratt had sent her to fetch the household ledger from the study at the far end, and the west passage was the most direct route. She heard Lady Harwick's voice first, pitched in the particular tone she used when she was performing frankness for a man she wished to impress. Then Sir Edmund's voice, lower, unhurried, the voice of a man who was not displeased with what he was hearing. "She is perfectly sensible," Lady Harwick was saying. "I want that understood between us. She hears and understands everything that is said to her." A pause. "The silence is simply compliance of a sort. She has learned what is required of her." Sir Edmund said something that Clara could not make out through the closed door. "No," Lady Harwick said. "She would not contest the contract. There is nothing she can do. She has no money, no legal standing. Her father's will was quite clear about the terms of her continued residency, and those terms depend entirely on my goodwill. If she proves troublesome, the parish house is less than 4 miles. I have spoken to the vicar." Another pause. "She knows this. She has known it for some time. That is why she is so very quiet." Clara stood in the west passage with the household ledger pressed against her ribs and the cold plaster wall at her back, and Lady Harwick's voice still in the air. And the thing that broke was not her composure. She had learned to be careful with composure, but some finer structure behind it, the one she had been holding upright by insisting that the terms of her situation were survivable, that patience was the shape of a life, that the silence would eventually purchase something worth having. It did not purchase anything, she understood now. It simply delayed the moment at which she would be moved, like a piece of furniture that had served its purpose in one room and was now needed in another. She returned the ledger to Mrs. Pratt without entering the morning room. She went back through the east corridor, through the entrance hall, and out the front door and down the gravel drive without her shawl, and she walked until she could no longer hear the house. The kitchen garden wall was ahead of her, and she stopped there with her back to the stone and the November air in her lungs. And she stood for a long time without moving. She heard him before she saw him. His step on the gravel, unhurried and deliberate, in the way of someone who has decided not to pretend he is not following. He came around the end of the kitchen garden wall and stopped a few feet from her, and he looked at her the way he had been looking at her since the beginning, with the particular attention of a man who has already decided what he is looking at, and does not need to be told. Clara kept her back against the stone. She was aware of the cold through the wool of her dress, and of her own breathing, which was more unsteady than she would have chosen. He did not fill the silence. He never filled silences. She had noticed this about him from the first, that he did not experience silence as a vacancy requiring decoration, but as something with its own weight and occasion, and he held it the way she had learned to hold it, which was to say, carefully, because what you set down in a silence reveals the shape of it. The afternoon was entirely quiet. The bare rose canes knocked against the garden wall in the wind. She became aware, standing there at the distance of 3 feet from a man who knew she was not what the household said she was, of the particular warmth of another person's attention in cold weather, the way it changed the air between 2 bodies in a way that had no respectable name in the grammar of Regency womanhood, and that she had refused to think about with any precision, because to think about it precisely was to want something she had no mechanism for wanting inside the life she currently occupied. She looked at her own hands. He said, "Whatever you heard." He stopped. He began again. "I would like you to know that you are not alone in it." He said it without drama, in the plain level voice he used for accurate observations, and she believed him in the way one believes a statement whose speaker does not appear to need it believed. She went to him in the library the following afternoon, and she spoke. 4 sentences. The first she had produced in front of another person in Harwick Park in nearly 3 years. Her voice was steady, if a little careful at the edges, the way a limb is careful when it has not been used in a long time, and the person trusts it but is not entirely certain yet. She told him what she had heard through the morning room door, and she told him about the parish house, and she told him that she intended to refuse Sir Edmund Granger's suit, regardless of what it cost her, because she had understood finally that the cost was the same whether she refused or did not, and she would rather pay it on her own terms. She said this clearly, looking at the map on the table rather than at him, in the manner of someone reading a prepared statement aloud. When she finished, the room was very quiet. He was standing at the far end of the table, very still, in the way he was still when he was most himself. He said, "Yes, just that." She looked at him then. He said, "I have been waiting to hear what you would decide." She understood in that moment something she had been circling for a fortnight, that he had not been waiting to see whether she would speak. He had been waiting to see what she would choose to do once she understood the full cost of it. The fire was low, and the library smelled of old paper and cold November, and the particular warm dust smell that old libraries have when the grate has been lit for the first time in months. She was aware of the distance between them across the table, and of the fact that she had not moved and he had not moved, and that the room held them both in it like a sentence that has not yet been completed. He looked at her, and she looked back, and neither of them moved for a long moment, the length of which was not proper, and which both of them knew was not proper, and which neither of them ended, because it was the nearest either of them had come to saying plainly what was already understood between them, and the Regency world did not readily supply vocabulary for a woman who had chosen courage over safety, or for the man who had been watching her make that choice from the moment he heard 2 words spoken to a terrier in a frozen kitchen garden. She looked at her own hand, which was resting near the edge of the map, and at his hand, which was near the other edge, and at the distance between them that was correct and appropriate, and that she was made to feel, in this moment, with a precision she had no business feeling. She took her hand from the table. She thanked him in a voice that was steady and clear and entirely unhurried, and she left the library, and she walked the length of the entrance hall with the particular posture of a woman who has said a brave thing and does not intend to examine it until she is somewhere private enough to do so safely. The announcement of Sir Edmund Granger's engagement to Miss Fenwick of Harwick Park was made at Lady Harwick's dinner on the 19th of November, delivered in the small drawing-room before 20 witnesses. The Aldridge family from the neighbouring estate, 2 solicitors from the county town, a clergyman and his wife, and several of the local families whose goodwill Lady Harwick had been assiduously cultivating throughout the autumn. Mr. Ashby was present, as the boundary survey was not yet concluded. Lady Harwick had placed him near the far end of the table, where surveyors properly belong. Clara was seated beside Sir Edmund. Lady Harwick rose and made the announcement in the voice of a woman performing a happy domestic occasion, and the room produced the sounds that rooms produce when such announcements are made. And Sir Edmund turned and looked at Clara with the expression of a man receiving the gift he had been promised. Clara looked at the candelabra at the centre of the table. She looked at the wax pooling slowly down the arms of it. She looked at the 12 faces turned toward her with the expectant warmth of an audience that has just been given permission to be pleased. She thought of the kitchen garden and the pressed gentian, and 4 sentences spoken clearly in an empty library. Then she looked at Lady Harwick. She said, "I'm afraid I cannot accept." The room went very quiet, not the comfortable quiet of a held breath, but the cold, specific quiet of a social occasion whose mechanism has stopped working. Lady Harwick's expression did not change immediately. She was too practiced for that. But something in her eyes sharpened, and Clara watched the calculation moving behind it, the rapid assembly of consequences and instruments. Clara, Lady Harwick said, in a tone of patient management entirely at odds with the drawing-room audience around her. I think perhaps you are unwell. I am quite well, Clara said. She was aware of the Aldridge daughters exchanging glances, of the clergyman's wife leaning slightly toward her husband, of Sir Edmund setting down his fork with a small, precise sound. Her voice was clear and steady and entirely unhurried, and she kept it that way, because composure was not the performance here. Composure was simply who she was when no one important was watching, and she had decided that the people in this room were not, in the final accounting, the audience whose opinion governed her. Lady Harwick rose slightly from her chair. "You will excuse us," she said to the room, directing it at Clara. "Miss Fenwick is not altogether—" "I have my speech perfectly," Clara said. The room stilled further. Sir Edmund was looking at her with the expression of a man who has just understood that a transaction he believed complete is, in fact, not. "I have always had it," she said. "I beg your pardon for the confusion." She looked at Lady Harwick directly, and she did not look away, and she said nothing more because the words had been spoken and they were already doing what words do when they are spoken clearly in a room full of witnesses. They were changing the arrangement of things. Lady Harwick sat back down. The silence stretched. Mr. Ashby was very still at the far end of the table. It was in the following moment, while Lady Harwick was visibly reassembling the instruments of her authority, that the drawing-room door opened. A man in travelling clothes entered. A secretary, by the look of him, carrying a leather case that bore on its clasp a small engraved seal. He paused inside the threshold and looked, with the brief directness of someone who has done this before, toward the far end of the table. "Your Grace," he said, "I beg your pardon for the hour. The matter in Northumberland requires your attention before morning." He set the leather case on the sideboard and took from it a folded document that bore the same seal, large and unmistakable on its exterior face. He placed it on the table near the salt and stepped back. The room had not moved. Lady Harwick was looking at the document. She was looking at the seal. She was looking at the far end of the table where Mr. Ashby sat, with the unremarkable posture of a man who has just had a door opened that he has been standing behind for some time. Her face performed several expressions in rapid succession, none of them ones she would have chosen in front of the Aldridge family. "Your Grace," Lady Harwick said at last, in a voice that was entirely unlike the one she had been using a moment before. He did not acknowledge the title immediately. He was looking at Clara. Clara was looking at him. He held her gaze with the same patient directness he had brought to the library and the kitchen garden and every other place in Harwick Park where he had stood and been something other than what the household said he was. Then he looked at Lady Harwick. "I believe," he said in the plain level voice he used for accurate observations, "that Miss Fenwick has already given her answer." He said it as one might note a fact that required only recording, not argument. The room was entirely silent. Outside the drawing-room windows, the November night was dark and clear, and the last of the candles in the entrance hall were visible through the glass, small and warm, and steady against the cold. Lady Harwick did not speak for a long moment. When she did, her voice had lost the performing quality. The assured social music of a woman in command of her domestic stage. What remained was smaller and harder, and recognizably uncertain. "I was not informed," she began, and stopped. She looked at the seal on the document. She looked at the faces of the Aldridge family, who had turned towards Edward Ashby, Duke of Aldenmere, with the instinctive attention of people who have just understood that the room they are in has a different centre of gravity than the one they were managing a moment ago. Mrs. Aldridge had straightened in her chair. Her husband had set down his glass. Even Sir Edmund was looking at the far end of the table now rather than at Clara, and in his expression was the recognizable quality of a man recalculating. Lady Harwick tried again. "The arrangement," she said, "with Sir Edmund has been declined," the Duke said, clearly and publicly. He looked at Sir Edmund. "I expect you heard it as well as I did." Sir Edmund said nothing. He looked at the table. Lady Harwick's hands on the white cloth of the table were very still, and Clara watched the careful architecture of the autumn. The letters to solicitors, the marriage settlement, the dinner arranged with its audience of county witnesses, the announcement delivered with such practised ease, dissolve in the space of a few minutes, not through any cruelty, but through the simple presence of a fact that the arrangement had depended on not being true. The Duke was here. He had been here for a fortnight. He had eaten in the estate office and held doors open for housemaids and stood in the kitchen garden and listened to 2 words spoken to a terrier. And none of those things were the actions of a man whose presence here was accidental. Lady Harwick understood this. Clara could see it in her face. The understanding arriving not as shock but as a slow and thorough correction, the kind that does not shout but simply cannot be undone. "I think," said the clergyman's wife, to no one in particular and everyone at the table, "that the evening has rather altered itself." Several people agreed. The conversation resumed in a different key. Clara rose from the table. She moved to the window at the near end of the drawing room, where the cold came through the old glass in the particular way it did in November, and she stood looking out at the dark garden and the bare rose canes against the wall, and she was aware after a moment of someone standing behind her at a correct and entirely proper distance. She did not turn immediately. She heard the room reasserting itself behind them. The careful social conversation of people who understand that the evening requires management. And she looked at the kitchen garden wall, just visible in the dark, and at the gap in the hedgerow that she could not see from here but knew was there. "I did not know," she said quietly to the window. "When you were in the kitchen garden, I did not know." "No," he said. "I know you didn't." A pause. "That is rather the point." She turned then. He was standing where she had expected him to be, at the correct distance, with the attentive, unhurried expression that had been the same on the first morning as it was now, as though nothing essential about the situation had changed, only the room's understanding of it. She looked at him with the actual face, not the performing one. His own expression was very still and warm and entirely certain, in the way of a man who has already decided something and is simply waiting for the world to arrange itself accordingly. She said, "You are a great deal of trouble, Mr. Ashby." He said very quietly, "Your Grace." She understood that this was a correction, and she understood also, from the careful warmth in his face, that it was the last correction of that kind he intended to make. Around them the drawing-room settled into its new arrangement, and the candles burned steadily in the November dark. And Clara Fenwick stood in the room where she had been dismissed 100 times by 100 small proceedings of Lady Harwick's social calendar. And she stood in it now as herself, whole, speaking, belonging. And the warmth of it was not triumph, because triumph would have asked her to perform something, and she had no performance left in her. It was simply this: the room and the candles, and the winter garden past the glass, and a man she had known, she thought, from the moment he held a door open for a housemaid with a tray. The fortnight that followed was the quietest of any she could remember since her father had been alive. Lady Harwick removed to her sister's house in Bath before the first frost, which was a practical decision, and one that spared everyone the particular discomfort of a correction that had nowhere left to go. Sir Edmund Granger took his settlement and his recalculations south without discussion. Mrs. Pratt, when Clara found her in the still room on the Thursday morning after the dinner, said nothing at all, only pressed Clara's hand once very firmly and returned to her work, which was the whole of what needed to be said. The Duke concluded his boundary survey with the efficiency of a man who had known its conclusions before he arrived, and the estate office was cleared of his papers, and the East guest room was put back to its usual state. And if the household at Harwick Park found the transition from surveyor to Duke somewhat less startling than might be expected, it was perhaps because the household had always understood, in the wordless way of people who watch carefully and say little, that Mr. Ashby had always been precisely what his bearing said he was. Nettie, pressing Clara's morning gown, said only that she had thought as much. Mrs. Pratt, overhearing this, said nothing, but she put an extra log on the still-room fire, which was her way of agreeing. On the Friday of that second week, Clara walked the kitchen garden in the pale morning light, which was the same cold November light it had always been, and the rosemary was cut back, and the terrier was asleep on the doorstep of the kitchen entrance, and the rose canes were bare against the stone wall. She had a letter in her pocket, unread as yet. She had been carrying it since the post came at dawn, turning it in her fingers while she dressed, noting the seal. She stopped at the gap in the hedgerow where she had not stood before, and she looked through it at the lane beyond, at the bare elms and the pale sky and the distant edge of the Aldenmere estate where the roof line showed just above the tree line, and she took the letter out and broke the seal and read it there in the kitchen garden with the cold air on her face, standing in the place where someone had stood and first heard her voice. She read it through once, and then she folded it carefully and held it against her palm for a moment, and then she put it back in her pocket. She stood for a little while longer in the November light. The terrier had woken and was watching her from the doorstep with the mild interest of a dog who has been untangled from a wire and has decided, in the uncomplicated way of dogs, that a person who does that is someone worth watching. She said, very quietly, "There you are." 2 words spoken into the cold morning air of the kitchen garden. But this time there was no cost in them, and no performance, and no careful calculation of what they might purchase or forfeit. This time they were simply true.